welcome back. Last week we went over HTML, adding the content, the structure to our site. This week we're gonna get started with some CSS, which is the coding language that is used to apply styling to your site. So that's fonts, colors, layout, animations even. This is, I think, where web development starts to get fun because you get to see, things that don't look like this all the time. And then next week, we're going to go through some more intermediate CSS stuff, more about how can you make your site scale better to different screen sizes so that it looks good on a laptop, on mobile, on a tablet. And then also some very basic JavaScript to add some more interactivity and behavior to your site. So just like we did with HTML, let's break down what CSS is. So CSS stands for cascading style sheets. And the cascading part means that when you apply a style to one of the parent elements in HTML, that it will apply to all of the children as well. So remember how when we were writing code that we had this like body one, and then within that we had header, and within that we had this link. This is where that cascade comes in. So if I were to apply something to my body, it's going to apply to this entire section and all of the stuff that's in that body. That's where the cascade comes in. Style sheets is actually from the world of printing. And this is when there would be like newspapers and stuff, and there would be one document that says, these are the fonts, this is the font size, this is the layout. It's a style sheet. It's a piece of document that tells how you should style the content. And the same thing applies here with our. So in general, it just describes how HTML elements should be styled. This is our colors, our fonts, our layout. And the nice thing about CSS is that if you link it externally, there's 3 different ways you can add CSS to your HTML code, and I will show you all 3. And if you link to it externally, you can use the same CSS document for multiple HTML files. Where last week I was saying how for every web page you want to create on your site, you should have a different HTML document. You can just have one CSS file and just link it to all of those so that you don't have to keep like copying and pasting code. It also can happen the other way around where you have multiple style sheets applied to the same HTML file. And there will be some rules about what styles actually get applied, and I'll explain those as well. So like HTML was built on elements, CSS is built on rules. And it's written a little bit differently than our HTML is written. And it starts off with what is called a selector. And a selector is going to be a little piece of code that tells the browser, these are the elements I want you to apply this rule to. So in this case, we're using a type of an element selector, in this case, the P selector. So this is going to target all of our body text. Remember in HTML where we had our paragraph text within those little carets and it was P? This is how you select all of those as well. It's just that thing in that HTML between those carets. And I'll show you a bunch of other selectors that you can use as well. Then we have a declaration block, which is our code in between these squiggly brackets. And this can have one or multiple different declarations or multiple different types of CSS code. And we'll have some that we write that is just one line. We'll have some that has multiple different things that we're applying to the same element. And you can do that all within one declaration block. And then within each declaration, there's a property and a value. Similar to how we did the HTML attributes, where it was like href equals this, or the alt equals this. It's very similar in CSS. This time it is this property name. So in this case, it's color. And then you add a colon, and then whatever value you want to put, followed by a semicolon. And so this one is a very simple one. It targets all of our body text, and it changes the foreground color or the text color to blue. It's the basic CSS rule. Now, something that gets a little tricky with CSS is you can sometimes apply conflicting rules, for example, where maybe you have multiple different style sheets, or maybe you wrote CSS code externally, but then also in your HTML file. And so there's things that can be more specific that allows you to override rules that are more general. So here we have more specific at the top to least specific at the bottom. So if we start from the bottom, our universal selector, which we will use, is an asterisk. And this applies to every HTML element. So when we put asterisk something, it's going to apply to everything on our HTML page. The next one is the element, which we already saw in this previous one, where it's just that value in between those carets in HTML. And this is going to select all of the HTML elements that have those tags. And then remember last week when we started adding IDs and classes in our attributes to HTML, we can use those here in CSS as well. So our class, as we remember, you can apply that to multiple different HTML elements. And so that's going to be a more specific than our element selector, but less specific than our ID, because ID is only for one element and one element only. And so if I had a rule up here at my ID level that was also at this universal level, the one that ID is set to will override the universal one, at least for the one that we have the ID set for that. And we'll see some examples of that. Now, the next thing is when you have multiple different ways that you add CSS. The first way, and we'll go through this one, this is the most common, is using the link tag to reference a external style sheet. So it's a completely separate file. The reason that this is the preferred method is that you can have all of your HTML code in one file and all of your CSS code in another. And so as you're debugging your site or testing things out, it's a lot easier to kind of separate your concerns where your HTML file isn't like hundreds of lines of code, and you can separate it and only think about the styling. The next way is through the style tag, which you put in the head section. And this you can put just a bunch of CSS code in between here. And this is going to be a little bit more specific than our external one because this is specific for this HTML document. And then you can also add it inline to one specific element. So if you didn't want to use an ID, for example, you can use the attribute style equals and then write your CSS code here. And this is the most specific because it's only applying to this specific paragraph element in this case. If you have multiple external style sheets like this, it actually is going to always be this later one. Because when you type in a domain name to your browser and it goes to the server and grabs the files, as it's reading through the files to determine how to display your site, it's reading from the top to the bottom. So if this first one had paragraph color is yellow, and then this one had paragraph color is pink, and I didn't have these ones down here, my paragraph text would actually be pink because it's just further down. They're saying like, I read that later, so that must mean it's more important. Cool. Specifically with colors, there's a bunch of ways that you can determine the color in CSS. The first one is through what is called named colors, and these are just keywords that you can find here, and I'll send out this link after. And this is just standard color names like black, silver, white, maroon, that you can just put color, colon, and then put that name in. They do have, in this one, they do have the related hex values, which is more specific. There is, I think, around like 100 something named colors. And so it is a little bit limited in terms of the amount of colors that you can use. But if, for example, you want pure black, you don't have to remember that it's all zeros. You can just write color black. The next way is through RGB values. And so you would write that by RGB, and then in your parentheses, you would have 3 values. Each of these are out of 255. And the first one corresponds to how much red is in the color. The second one's how much green, and the third one is how much blue. This RGBA, the A stands for alpha channel, which is also known as opacity. And this is a fourth value that you add that is between 0 and 1. 0 means it's fully transparent, it's like invisible, and 1 means that it's fully opaque or it's like fully colored, essentially. And then we have hue, saturation, and lightness. You also might hear hue, saturation, and brightness. The same thing. This first value is the hue. So it's a color between 0 and 360 based on a color wheel. Saturation is a percentage between 0 and 100. 100 means that it's like fully that hue color, and 0 means that it's like gray. And the percentage is going to be differences between those. And then lightness is a kind of a funny one. It is also a percentage. However, this one, 50% is the color that you chose. 100% is pure white and 0% is pure black. And this also has that alpha channel or the opacity. You can add a fourth value there. But if you're going to pick specific colors, this hex code at the bottom is actually the most common. And that's what we'll be practicing with and be playing around with. The hex code is just another way to write your RGB up here. Now, you might be wondering, like, how do I remember all these different color codes and stuff? The answer is you don't. You find them online. And so my two main preferred places to go to find what colors I want to use. The first one is called realtimecolors.com. I like this one because it gives you a little sample site where you can kind of see just like how they've laid it out and the colors and how they work together. You can specify specific colors for these different things. Like if you want to change the text, you can change it to red and see how that looks and see if that works. I think that doesn't look the best, but some people might. But my favorite part is if you press space bar, it randomizes it for you. And so I normally just like jump on here and I press space bar until I find something that I like. And then when you like the colors, you just click this export button and you can see those hex colors right here. Yes. Yes. Yeah, it does pretty good. I don't normally get really gross color combinations. There's some that just don't look the best, but they do randomize it, but there is some that like they won't do the same color for like these two. I don't believe that they have like a specific like color harmony thing in the background. Yeah. But the thing that does, which is the next one, is Adobe Color. So with Adobe Color, which you can get to by going to color.adobe.com, over here, there's this color harmony setting. And if I were to change that, for example, to monochromatic, it'll change this and I can just click and drag around and get to a color scheme that I like. Once you find it, if you just hover over that hex code and click it, it'll copy it to your clipboard and you can just Control V or Command V to paste later. What I also think is a really cool feature is this extract theme option, where if you select an image that you like, and I just pulled one of the images that we are going to use, it'll actually go into your image and pick a theme from the colors that are in there. So if you find like a website that you like, just take a screenshot and you can just drag it over here and it'll give you some different things. And then also there's this accessibility tools checker. You want to make sure that your text color and your background color are contrasting enough so that those who maybe have worse vision than we do can still see your content, especially those with color blindness. So right now, it actually tells me that it's a 3.84 to 1 ratio for this. And then it's telling me, hey, that's not good. The standard is 4 to 1. It is saying like I could probably use this for 18 points and above or 14-point bold and above and for icons, but if it's regular text at this, they say I'm failing that. You can also change it to colorblind safe mode with your theme, and this will tell you if there's colors that are too close to each other and that they would look similar to those with, and it actually goes specifically to the different types of color blindness as well. So those are some ways that you can find what colors to use. And then there's two ways I want to show you to determine what fonts you want to use. Fonts can be a little funny, as fonts are determined by what each user has installed on their computer. And so my computer has certain fonts that are installed that yours will probably have different. And so if I try to access a site that has a font that I don't have, but you do, you might see it completely different than I do because I can't see that font because I don't have it. And so the first thing to do is to look at cssfontstack.com. And this is a collection of fonts that are generally available on most computers. There are some examples that for some reason are included in here that aren't that great, but you'll see some that have like almost, 100% on different platforms, and I'll tell you how much. And when we write our code, we can set what are called fallback fonts. So let's say I really like Geneva right here, but only 2% of Windows machines are going to have that. I can set something else like Arial as a fallback font. So it'll go, hey, if you have Geneva, we'll display it in Geneva. But if you don't, we'll go to Arial and we'll display the content in Arial. If you want to get really fun with your fonts, go to fonts.google.com because there's a really easy way to install these fonts in your code. And I'll show you how to do that. So what we're going to do is let's find some fonts that we like. So I actually found two already that I want to use for this. And the first one is called Montserrat, Montserrat. And when you click on it, you can see this sample and all of these different styles that are available for you. And click this Get Font button in the top right. And you'll see that it says one font family selected, and I want to select a second one. So I'm going to go back to fonts, and I am going to look up Work Sans, which is the other one I'm going to use. I'll click on it. I'll click Get Font. And then now in this top right, I have my little shopping cart, and it shows that I have two things here. And you can do two things. You can download the font to have it installed on your computer, or you can get this embed code. And that's what we're going to do. So if you click Get Embed Code, and then it already gives us some HTML code right here. So if I just click this Copy Code button, and then I'm going to go over to my VS Code in my HTML document, and in my head section, I am going to paste this code. So what this essentially does is it adds a link to those fonts in Google Fonts, so that if I change all of the text to these fonts and someone visits my site, even if they don't have these installed on their computer, they're going to see it with the fonts that I select. Cool. So let's get started with writing our own code. Does anyone have questions about those things that we briefly covered? Cool. So like I said before, there's three ways that you can add CSS code to your site. The first way is going to be through another link that we're going to do. So at the very end of your head section, right before the closer, if you start a new line and do open caret, link, and then type in REL for the attribute, this is that relationship one. And if you do equals style sheet, this essentially makes sure that we're telling browsers that, hey, this is going to be a link to our CSS. Now we actually have to have a file to link to. So with the project folder open in VS Code, if you click the plus button, and let's start a new file, I'm going to name it style.css. And it's going to open it for me, but I'm going to go back here. Let's press space, and now let's link to it. And we do it in the same way that we did links last week. So it's href equals period / and then we see our CSS code. And then let's close it. So that was in my head section. I did the link tag, the REL equals style sheet, and our href equals this new link to our CSS code file that we started. Now, before I get too far, I like to make sure that it works. So I'm going to save it, and I'm going to go over to my CSS code file, and I'm just going to do that very simple code that we did before as the example. So I'm going to type in P to target all of our body text, that opening squiggly bracket, and then I'm going to enter to do a new line. And then I'm going to do color and then blue. After every property, you do have to have this colon, and after every value, you do have to have the semicolon. So if I save this and I go and I've already opened that HTML as in my live server with that extension that I showed last week, and I can see that all of my text has changed to blue. So that means that I did my linking properly. There is ways that you can add CSS code directly into your HTML file. So you could go like this, add this style tag in between the head, and then I could also put like P color red, for example, and you'll see that it changes to red because it's a little bit more specific. Most people like to have a separate CSS file because let's say like for some reason this link breaks or something is corrupted in the file, you could have it separated so maybe at least some content still displays. Or when you're going back to trying to troubleshoot your code, that when you're looking at your HTML file, it's only HTML code. And then when you go to your CSS thing, it's only CSS code. So now let's start actually writing some more of our CSS code so that we can change this to look a lot better. So I have this like really blown up because it's on a projector and I want you to be able to see it. But you also might not love switching back and forth and you have to like go through your code and be like, oh, what do I have to do? So if you click on one of the files in VS Code and then you control click, you can split to a different way. So I'm going to split right. And this allows me to have kind of just two different panes. So one that has my HTML code and one that has my CSS code. And so that way I don't have to keep going back and forth and back and forth, and I can see them both at the same time. Okay, so let's delete this rule that we did where we changed all the body text to blue. That was just so that we can confirm that our code was working, that link. So the first thing I want to show you is going to be some comments. So we didn't go over this last week in HTML, so I'll do it real quickly for HTML. But comments are code that you can write that will not show up when you're viewing a site. And so they're really helpful if you're going to be working with multiple different people, or if you are going to take a break from this project for a while and then you come back and you want to understand what everything's going on about. So in HTML, if you want to write a comment, you would do a opening caret, an exclamation point, and then two hyphens. And you'll notice that it already adds that ending, but the ending is two more hyphens and then the closing caret. And this is text that I can write that will not show up when someone visits my site. So I could say this is going to be my hero section. And then down here, I could do one that's like about section. And this is just primarily for code readability, so that if someone else is looking at your code and they want to understand what's going on, you can leave them little notes. You can leave little notes to yourself as well. I will show you a way that someone could see these. So I don't recommend that you like write like really crazy stuff in here or really rude stuff or anything, because there is a way that someone could see them. Most people don't know how to access it, but I'm going to show you how to do it so you could even see other websites and what they're writing. So I'm going to save that HTML one. I'm not going to add a bunch of comments throughout, but if you would like, you can. In CSS, they also allow for comments. This one's a little bit differently because it is a different language. So it's a different syntax. This one is a forward slash and then an asterisk. And then you can type your comment. So in this case, I'm going to write global styles, because this is going to be my section of styles that I'm going to apply to things that go all over my site. And then to end the comment, you do the same thing in reverse. So you do an asterisk and then another forward slash. And that makes sure that if you start writing code after, that it doesn't think that it's a comment still. So when you want to start a comment, forward slash asterisk. When you want to end one, it's asterisk forward slash. So the first thing that I want to change is this background color, let's say. We'll go through all the colors first because those are fun. The background color right now is white by default. Each browser, so Chrome, Firefox, Safari, have their own default styling. But let's say I want to change it. I'm not a huge fan of pure whites or pure blacks on sites. If you want, you can. But so I'm going to change it to something that's a little bit of a off-white. So the first thing that I need to determine is the selector. Remember, for each CSS rule, we need to have a selector which targets which HTML element to apply the style to. That's why I like to do the split screen so that I can scroll through my HTML to figure it out. And remember that we have the cascade. So whatever we apply to the parents go all the way down to all their children. And so I'm going to actually go all the way to this main one that we have. If I use this collapsing. I can see that all of my code is within this HTML tag, which is good. You want that. So I'm going to target this HTML tag. Now, if you're going to target an element, you just have to type in the element's name. So in this case, I just have to do HTML. And this is going to target my HTML element, which contains all of my other ones. And I'm going to do space, opening curly bracket. I'm going to enter. And then to change the background color of any element, it's a super simple property. It is called background color. And as you start typing, you'll see it pop up here. There is a hyphen in between that. And you'll notice that they do have some of those default named colors show up as options. I'm going to use a custom one. So I'm going to do a hex code, which you use by the hashtag or the pound sign. And then the one that I did was FD, FD, FA. What's really nice about VS Code is if you hover over this color thing, it'll bring up this color picker as well. So you can kind of see where it is in the thing. It's just slightly off-white. If I were to drag this over, for example, it will change that value for me. I'm going to Command Z to undo that. And if I Command S, and I'm making sure that I'm saving both files, if I change anything and I go back, it's going to be slightly different. It is very close to white, but that way it's just not a pure white. So now, as I said, I also don't like using pure black for stuff. So I'm going to change all of the elements. Now, what I can do instead is if I want to apply it to every element, even though the HTML is kind of doing that, I just want to make sure. So I'm going to use what's called the universal selector, and this is going to select every element on my page. And I'm going to do that by putting up an asterisk and then a space, and then the same things of my curly brackets. This time to set the foreground color or the text color, it's just color. And in this case, I am going to use the hex code of 120B09. And I'm going to save that. And again, doesn't change much. It's very close to pure black, but I think it's just a little bit easier on the eyes. All right. So the next thing I want to change is the colors of these buttons right here. I don't like how those buttons look. We're going to make them look a lot prettier. So how I can do that is I'm going to select all of my buttons. I want this to apply to every single button on my page. So I'm going to start a new section and I'm going to write this comment of button styles. And to select all of my buttons, I just have to put in that button tag name. And then I'm going to change those to a background color of 85B, 8BF. 85B, 8BF. Now it's going to change it to this blue. I don't love how the black color of the text looks on the blue, so I'm going to change it to my background color, which is that kind of like off-white color from before. And I am just going to copy and paste from before. And if I save, and I can go back and I can see now that I have this blue background color that kind of matches this logo I designed, and then a white text color. Yes. Yeah, so background colors, the background and the color one is technically what's called a foreground or what's in front. Mostly it's just going to be your text color. Those are going to be our two main color properties. There's a bunch more, but for mostly what you're going to do, it's going to be background color and foreground color. We might be adding some more of these later on as we're styling elements, but just a little preview of how you can change the colors of different elements. So now we've installed these Google fonts on our HTML code, and we want to start using them because still this is using whatever the default Chrome font is. So there's a bunch of different font properties. The first one, which we're going to apply to our universal element, because we want to apply this to every single element on our thing, is going to be font hyphen family. And this is the property that you use to determine what the typeface is. So Times New Roman, Arial. In our case, we have Montserrat and Work Sans. So I'm going to use that Montserrat. And all you have to do is type it. Now it's not going to give it to you by default because it's not in the system, but you can just go right over here and look at the Google font name and just make sure you're typing it in correctly. Now, like I said, even though we're including this, we still want to have some sort of a backup. If for some reason, like let's say Google Fonts goes down and it's just none of their fonts are working across the web, we want to make sure that we can still somewhat style our site. So let's add a fallback font. So I'm going to go to my CSS font stack website. I'm just going to look for one that is applied to most things. I think Arial will just do right here. And so to add a fallback font, you just got to add a comma and a space and then type the next one. And so what this does is it's going to look and say, hey, do we have access to Montserrat? Which we should because we have the Google fonts. If not, we'll go and display this in Arial. And then you'll notice at the very end of this suggestion, there's this thing called sans serif. And this is just like a default generic one. If you look at a bunch of different font sites, you'll see sans serif and serif, or you'll also see it in over here in Google Fonts. The main difference is like serif is those ones like Times New Roman where they have like the little feet and like the little hanging things on the T where there's like the things going down, and serif sans serif doesn't have those. Yes, you can have as many fallback fonts as you want. So normally add a couple, and then at the very end, if it's going to be a serif font, you just use the serif keyword. In our case, we're using a sans serif one. So we can just go like this to say, hey, look for Montserrat. If that's not available, go to Arial. If that's not available, go to just whatever sans serif font, like the default one. But you can add as many fallback fonts as you want. All right. So if I save that and I go back to my preview of my site, you'll see that my font has changed. And I'm seeing the font that I like and that I use. The next thing I want to show you is you'll see in these navigation ones, because these are links, they have this default underline. These are good for like a visual indicator that it's clickable. I personally don't like underlines on links. It's personal preference. So I'm going to show you how to get rid of them. But it's important to have some sort of other visual indicator that they are clickable. So I'll also show you how to do that as well. So all of my links are going to be my A elements, right? So because the A is our link right here. So let's do a new section. I'm going to call this header and footer styles. So this is mostly going to be my header and my footer stuff. And then I'm going to just do A as the element selector. I'm going to select all my links. And the underline property is going to be determined by this text decoration setting. So it's text hyphen decoration. And you'll see that I have a ton of different options right here. By default, a link is going to have underline, and like body text is going to have none. So we're just going to override that default and put none right here. And when I save, I'll go back and I'll see that all of my links don't have that underline anymore. But I want to have that visual indicator that it's a clickable link. And a way that we can do that is through something like these like real-time colors, where it's like a color that shows when you hover over something. And so you can do that by what's called a pseudo class. This is a little confusing because we haven't gone through how to target a class that you've set over here, like class equals logo. But each element will have what are called pseudo classes that are determined on what you're doing with that. And you can use those by doing the element and then a colon and then what the pseudo class is. So in this case, we're going to do a colon hover. And this is going to say, hey, for all of my links, change the styling when someone's hovering over them. And in this case, I want to change the color, and I'm going to change it to my blue that I'm using up here. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it in. And when I save, I can go back to my site. And when I hover over, it's going to change the color only when I'm hovering over it, which I think is pretty cool. All right. So let's work a little bit more on these lists up here. Eventually, we're going to get it so that they're like a menu that shows up over here. But right now, it's having this default list behavior. So let's start overriding some of those. So I'm going to create a new section with some new comments. called navigation styles that is going to be specific for my navigation menu. Now, I want to apply this styling to two different things. I want to apply it to my list elements right here, but I also want to apply it to my buttons. So you might think, okay, I have to do li and then type in some CSS right here, and then I have to go down here and do button, or go back up to my buttons over here and like change it over there. But there's a way that you can combine selectors in CSS so that you don't have to write several lines of code, and you can apply the same style to multiple different elements. And it's super simple. All you got to do is put a comma and a space between them. So if I did li, comma, space, button, now everything that I write in these brackets is going to apply to both my list elements and my button elements. So I am going to first do list hyphen style. And this is gonna target what sort of indicator they are over here. So right now they're bullets. But because I want to use them as a menu, I probably don't want something, so I can just do none. And then I also want to make them a bit bigger because they're a little small. So you can change the size of a font by doing font hyphen size. And in this case, I'm going to do 16 pt, which is points. And if I save that and I go, I can see that they're a bit bigger. They don't have those bullets over here anymore. There's a ton of different units you can use for different things, and we'll be exploring a bunch of them as we go through content today and next week. Now, the next thing is we do have some default styling for our H1 and our H2s, and then all of these project one names are these like H3s. And I want to configure those to be a little bit more how I want them to be. So I'm going to create another section with a comment called text styles. Now I want to apply this to all of my H1s. So right now, as I said last week, you should only have one H1 per page. And this is because it's your page title. It's the most important heading. You shouldn't really have competing ones throughout your code. But I'm thinking ahead and say, oh, I might want to apply this CSS style sheet to multiple different pages. So if I were to specifically target this H1 in a certain way, like if I were to put like ID equals this, I would have to make sure that I would put the ID equal to that in the other pages as well. So I am just going to select my H1 and I am going to change a couple of different things. The first thing is going to be our font size again. I want to make it a lot bigger. I'm going to do 72 points. It'll be huge. And then the next one that I want to show you is called font hyphen weight. And this is essentially how much bold it is. So normal body text is bolded at a 400 level. And you can use the terms bold, bolder, or lighter, but you can also use these number values to determine. So I want it to be slightly bolder than it is right now. And I'm just going to do 500. And when I save, it goes like that. It's bigger. I actually think it maybe decreased the boldness because I think by default it was bold and I made it just a little bit different. But that's how you can change how bold a given piece of text is. Now let's add some stuff for other headings as well. We do have an H2. We have a couple of them. Font size, I'm going to put to 24 points. And I'm also going to put that font weight to 500. In terms of like how you should determine what values to put in these, like how did I come to 72 for my H1 and 24 for my H2? It's a lot of playing around and trial and error. And so now I see my headings are a bit bigger. And then I'm going to do the same for my H3s, which are all my project names. But I'm going to do font size 18 points and a font weight of 500. And I'll save that to also apply it to there. And I can see that right here. I did 18. Now I have this hero section up at the top, which is like just kind of just like this big section near the top. And I have this subtitle that I want to use, but I used it as a paragraph element. And so if I wanted to change it, I could use, let's say, like the P, and then I could say like, you know, the font size is, let's say 24. But when I save that, it's going to apply to all of my paragraph elements. So now it's applying to this stuff too, and I don't really want that. So we need to do something a little bit more specific. And I put an ID of subtitle right here. So we can target the element with this set. To target a subtitle, or not a subtitle, an ID, you use the pound or the hashtag sign, and then you type in the name of that ID. So in this case, we did ID equals subtitle. Down here, we can do the hashtag subtitle. And when we save, we'll notice that it's only applying to that paragraph subtitle because I've set that ID to subtitle, and then I put the code to link to that ID specifically. Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so now we've done some stuff with our fonts and our colors, but now I want to show you how you can start impacting the size of different elements. Because, we put in this logo and it was kind of big, and we put in these images and they're super big. And maybe we want like this button to have more space in between the text and like the sides. And this is all done through what is called the CSS box model. And I find the way to show this the best is to use a tool called Chrome Developer Tools. So if you go under Chrome, you can go to View, Developer, and then Developer Tools. You can also right click or control click and then go to Inspect. So if I use this button up here, I can go and target a specific element. So if I want to target, let's say this image, and if I click on here, I will see where that is in my HTML code. And if I go to styles, I can see the different CSS code that is applying specifically to this image. Now you'll see the stuff that we've applied through that universal selector already. And remember that applies to every element. But then we see this image one right here, but we didn't add any CSS to do our images yet. This is from what's called the user agent style sheet. And this is the Chrome style sheet right here. So by default, it's already giving me some CSS code from how Chrome wants to show this stuff. So it's also kind of fun to see what they think it should look like. But down here is our box model. So the way that a piece of content is displayed in the web is determined by these four things. So this first one in this blue is the actual size of the content itself. So this image, for example, is 5,280 pixels by 2,970 pixels by default. Now we can configure this in CSS by using our height and our width properties. So I'm going to start a new section that are going to be our project styles. Now we're going to also use a bit of a fancy selector for these. So if I go in my HTML code, I can see that I have this div element, that's my project main section, and then I have all of these different project cards. But let's say I want to target all of these images, and I don't want to add a class, let's say, or IDs, and I don't want to have to like accidentally apply them to other images I may include on this page. We can use what are called descendant selectors. So what you do is you go to the parent element. So in this case, it's this div, ID equals project one card, class project card. And I'll see that each of my images is the direct descendant of a div. So this one is for this one. This one down here is a child of this one. And this one is a child of this one. I can see that all of the parents, I already put this class of project card. So what I can do is I can type in period project card. The period says, hey, look for a class that is equal to this, similar to how the pound sign said subtitle. But now this is going to apply to all of these div elements right here. But I want it to be the images inside of them. So how you can do that is you can press a space and then this forward caret and then another space. And then I'm going to put IMG. So this is really fancy syntax that says, hey, look for everything that has a class of project hyphen card. Go within them and find if they have an image. and apply this style to those images. So now I don't have to add classes to all of these images. I don't have to worry about applying it to other images by accident. And we can write our code in here. Height is going to be a very simple one to do because you just got to type height. Now this time we're going to do something that is slightly different, where before we were using points, you can also use pixels for height. I'm actually going to use a percentage instead. So I'm going to put 65%. And what this does is it looks at my screen and it's going to say only do 65%. But you'll notice it doesn't do anything because it's looking at my width as well. So right now, if they were to do this, my thing will probably be very squished like this. So they want me to set a width as well. So if I want my image, let's say, to go across these sections, I can put width, and then I'm going to set that to 100%. And if I save, you'll notice now that all of my images just go all the way across. But you might also notice that there's this white space around these. And you'll notice too that our values have changed in our element right here. So I can look through here and there's nothing here that's kind of saying like, hey, there's something different. And so what I did was I played around and I said, okay, let's go to HTML then. And let's see if there's anything here. And I can look here and I'm seeing, okay, in HTML, there's nothing here. If I go to body, and you'll see that it's already highlighting in orange around. And I can see that there's this orange value in our margin. We're using Chrome developer tools, which if you're opening your site in Chrome, you can get to by doing control click and then going to inspect or clicking on view and then developer tools. And so when I was looking at these images, which I applied a width of 100% to, I noticed that there was still some leftover margins. And so I went all the way up and I checked HTML. I don't see any margins here. I went down to body, which also contains it, and I can see them right here. So now if I want to remove these borders, these margins, I can go and target my body element. So if I go all the way back up to global styles, and I can do body, and there's only one body element in this. And so what I can do here is also change my margins. So here I'm going to put margin, and then I'm going to put 0 as my value. And what this does is it's now going to change it where there's no margin on the top, and I don't have those margins on the sides anymore. Now, this margin is actually a shorthand for 4 different properties. They're all related. And so if I got rid of this, let's say, and I wanted to use, let's say only the left and the right, I only wanted to change. I still wanted those top margins. I can do margin hyphen right and set it to 0, and margin hyphen left and set it to 0. There's also a margin top and a margin bottom, but you can configure all of them at once by using this margin property. Now you may be wondering, okay, if I use this margin property, do I have to set all of the margins still equal to each other? Or if I wanted them to be different, could I go and use this still? And the answer is actually yes. So the margin shorthand actually simplifies it from top, left, bottom, right. So if I included 4 different values here, let's say 15, 30, 45, and 60. And let's say I add specifically pixels so that we're being super specific with how much we want it to be. What this is going to do is it's going to set 15 pixel of a margin to the top, 30 pixels of a margin from the right, 45 from the bottom, and 60 from the left. So this is going to look really weird, but I just wanted to show you how this looks. So now I can see I have a bit of a margin here, a slightly bigger one over here, an even bigger one over here, and then the biggest one over here. You usually don't do something like this. Okay, so that is 2 of these things within our box model. So I'm going to go back up to those images. Let's go to the first one. And I'm going to click on this button right here to go in and select my element. And remember, blue is going to be our content size. So this is width times height. Margin is going to be the distance between this element and those around it as well. But then we have this border and this padding. So a border is a visible or invisible kind of line around your content. So right now I have a 0 border on here, but if I were to go up to this contact, for example, you're going to see that there is a border right here. And so in this case, it's a visible one. In this case, it's nothing. You can also set it to be like a size, but then like don't put a value in there, but like make it like clear so that it doesn't show. It's a little complicated. But then there's this concept of padding. And the padding is going to be the distance from your content to your border. So in this case, for our button, we have our content here. The padding is going to be this kind of extra space around it. And then the border is this black line. So let's make this button a little bit more friendly and a little bit bigger. And let me find where I can do that. Okay, so I am going to, let's create a new section. I'm going to call this button styles. You'll see that I'm duplicating some stuff. So I probably could put some stuff up here in this button, but we're going to just completely separate it. So for all of my buttons, I want there to be no border. And so I'm going to put border none. And when I do that, and I go back, I'm going to see that I don't see that black line around there anymore. If I wanted to configure something slightly different, I could use 3 values here. So the first value that you'd put in the border is how thick you want it to be. So let's say I put 15 pixels. It's going to be huge. The next value you put in is if you want it to be solid, or if you want it to be dashed, or if you want it to be dotted. So let's play around with dotted because we already saw solid. It was a solid line. And then the third value is going to be your color. And so I'm going to do this as green, let's say. And when I save and I go back here, I can see that I have a really weird border, but it's a 15 pixel dotted green border. So let's set that back to none. And then I'm going to target specifically my contact button right here. And so I have my contact button up here in my header, but then I also do have it down here in my contact section and in my footer. So let's say I have some styles I want to apply to only my contact buttons. And if I look at them, they all do have a class already of contact button. So remember to target a class, you do period and then the name of the class. And now what I want to do here is I want to change that padding number right here. So this is going to be the distance between that text and then the sides of my button. So in this case, I'm going to put a larger amount on the right. So I can put padding right, let's say 70 pixels, and then padding left 5 pixels. This might look a little weird right now, but if I go back, I can see right here, cool. I got some more sides to here and more sides to here. Now, the reason that looks a little bit weird is because we haven't set any other kind of types of stuff to like align it in the center, to like change the size of how big the button is. So let's say I want all my buttons to be bigger. So let's go to our button rule right here, and let's add a width of 100 pixels. That's gonna be 100 pixels wide. Let's add a height of 30 pixels. When I save that and I go back, I will see now that something's a little kind of funky happening. There's some conflicting rules, but I can see that right here, I have that 100 pixel height or width, and then this 30 pixel right here for my view buttons. But you'll notice that some of them, like the download button, the contact button, looked a bit different. And that's because I probably want those to be slightly different in terms of their size. And you can do that by targeting those IDs or those classes, making something that's more specific than this button right here. We'll be adding a bunch of different rules that will make these look a lot better than we're doing right now. Okay, how are we feeling about the colors, the fonts, the box model, determining the sizes of content? Yes. So when you're targeting an ID, it's a pound symbol and then the name of the ID. And then a class is going to be a period and then the name of the class. This one is the descendant one. So this is going to look for every element that has a class of project card, like this one right here, this one right here, and this one right here. And then it's going to go within those elements and look for an image. So this is if you didn't want to add like IDs and classes to these images, you could go and say, hey, I already have all of these divs set up for project card, and I can just target those classes and then say, look within and target those images. The box model. Yeah.
That's it.
Yes. Yeah. So all of those changed when I go back and I look at this image, for example, I can see that my content size changed. If I go back to my body where we changed the margin, I no longer see a value in the margin. The awesome thing about Chrome developer tools is that this isn't actually impacting any of your code, which is great in the sense of you can play around with stuff and not feel bad that you're going to mess something up. And it also means that you can go to other sites. So if I went to, let's say, the annenberg.usc.edu, and I was like, hey, I'm really curious about like what this yellow color is, I can control click, inspect, see the code. I can hover over it and I can go over here and see what color code that they're using. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So if I go to, let's say let's get to our, where it says, welcome to USC Annenberg. Maybe I want to say, I am awesome. And I enter, it's going to change the text on that site. But because when you are getting your files from a server, you get kind of like a local copy. If I refresh and re-ask for those files, it's going to go back to what it is. I'm not screwing over the Annenberg site at all.
So if we like a certain format of a specific website, then we can go through this developer and see how they.
Yeah, you can see how they formatted the colors and stuff. You'll see like with like all the CSS and like all this HTML, it gets a little complicated. It's also nice if you're going to use something like a WordPress site, like a web builder. They have their own kind of code, but it actually compiles back into HTML and CSS. And so if you are using something like a WordPress or a Wix or something, and you're like, hey, I still want to kind of see how this is kind of set up and like how I can maybe change it, you can see the code behind it as well. Yes. Yeah.
So essentially, everything we've been typing on is this one that will show up.
Yes. Yeah. And like I said, where I was like, oh, there is a way that you can see the comments. You can see them right here that I wrote by deleting them. Yeah. You can't hide this. So when you publish your code to anything that's hosting, it's the code and people can see it. So you can't write anything that you can like fully hide. You could do, for example, like if you for some reason wanted like your H1 to like not show, you could put like display like none. And when I go here, my like title disappears, but I can still go in and see like that it is still in the code. So you can't really like hide anything in the code. Yeah. Cool. Another thing I forgot with the text is I showed a little bit about the bold with this font weight. But now I want to show how you can make something italic. So if I wanted, let's say let's get rid of this. Let's say I wanted these project names to be italic. What I can do is go in and find how I can target those in my HTML. So those are all my H3s. And the font style property. So font hyphen style determines if you want it to be italic or not. So if you put italic and you save, you can see that it updates in our view. I'm recording this so like you can go back later. So then I want to show you a little bit of some of the stuff that we're going to start doing, especially next week. So this is going to be how can we make this a bit more laid out better. When I resize my screen, it doesn't look great on smaller screens. So maybe I want to change some stuff around. And there's a couple different ways that you can do this. The first way is that you can set what's called a media query. And this will look at some sort of property of the device that the user is accessing from your site from. So you can set something like, hey, I want if the screen is this wide, that you change this thing about the code. Or if the screen prefers dark mode, that I want you to change these colors. There's also this concept of flexbox, which is a bit intermediate. And what these do is it allows you to more dynamically show stuff in a 1D plane. So for example, we're going to use that with our logo and our navigation menus. So we all want them to all be in one line right here. So Flexbox is great for that. And then grid is also going to be great if you want to do more two-dimensional stuff. So I want these to be more kind of card-like in my projects. Like I want them to be cards side by side. And then when you like maybe scroll that they go to one column. And so you can use something like CSS grid for that. So let's start by playing around with how can we get some of this stuff to be more centered, which I think a lot of people like. We have the class of squished on a couple of this. So how can we get it so that they're kind of centered, but they have all these margins, even when we got rid of our margins on our body. So let's start doing some of that stuff. So first, let's start with this header and footer. So it's basically the same thing. And I'm going to take this one really slow because it can be a little confusing. So if we go to our header and footer styles, and let's put header, comma, footer. And this is going to target both our header section and our footer section. Now to create what is called a flex box or a flex container, you put it on the parent element. So in this case, we have our header right here, and we want to kind of lay out all of this stuff. And the same thing with the footer. We have our footer and lay out all of this stuff. So on the parent one, so header and footer, we're going to set the display to flex. Now, if I just save this and I go back, you'll notice that it already tries to do some stuff about putting them side by side. Not exactly how I want it to be, but we're getting there. Now, the next thing is I'm going to put align items to center. So when you've put something in this flex box, you can start doing stuff like aligning items and justifying content. And we'll play around with that one later too, where if we go back now, you'll see it doesn't change much yet. So align items determines horizontally, in this case, how they're distributed. In this case, I'm saying like, hey, with my container, I want you to do them where they're centered this way. If I were to go and put the height, and you don't have to do this, to something like super big, and I save that, and I go back, you'll notice that now my header is huge, and these items are right horizontally center. If I were to do justify content, and I do this as center, you'll notice now that they're horizontally centered. So before, the align items was doing what's called the cross axis. So I created a flex box that was like, hey, I want you to align stuff this way. And that's the default, is going left to right. So when I do align items, I'm saying, hey, going from up to down, where do I want it to be? And then justify content is left to right on that main axis where I want them to be. So I'm going to get rid of both of these. Now I want there to be a bit more of a margin between this side and this image right here, which is my logo. So if I want to do that, I can target header, the descendant, and then image. So header into image, and this is going to target my image element that's within my header. And I can do the same thing. I can add footer, descendant, image. Now remember, to move something with that white space, we do our margin. I'm going to specifically do margin left, 25 pixels. And now when I do that, and I see there's a slightly bigger thing, not by a ton, or just setting a standard. So now I'm going to go further, and I have my link kind of where I want it to be, but I want to also have these list items. So right here, I also want those to be side by side. So I can also do that by creating another within that Flexbox. So here I can see that this is the container for all of those elements that I want to put side by side. So I can put UL and display flex. I'm targeting this list and I want all of my content to be displayed in my flex box. So now I can see that they're side by side a bit more. All right. So then what I want to do now is I want to have some more space in between them because right now they're just like right back to back to back. So how we can do that again is through a very similar method, targeting our parent container, this UL, and then using our descendant, and then going to LI. So now I'm saying, hey, look for all of my unordered lists, go within them, see these list elements, and let's add that margin. So if I put margin, I'm going to say 0 and then 10 pixels. So what this is saying, I said how you can use margin to specify top, right, bottom, and left in that order. When you specify 2, the first number is going to do your top and your bottom at the same time, and the second number will do your left and your right at the same time. So this is just a quicker way so that I don't have to set them for each one. So now we're getting them spaced out a little bit more. So I want my logo to be slightly smaller. I know that my logo is a image, it's a link, but I see I have put class equals logo on both of them. So let's target that by doing period logo. And then I'm going to put a width of 100 pixels and then a height of 500 pixels or 50 pixels, sorry. And then now my logo is a bit better sized with the rest of my content. So now I want to have all of these way over there. I want to have just my logo over here, and I want to have a navigation menu over here in the top right. And so how we can do that is for our logos, let's set the float property. So what float does is it tells this element to go a certain direction as far as they can. So I'm going to do float left. So I'm saying, hey, I want my logo to be as far left as it can be. I'm going to save that. And then the next thing that I want to do is to target my nav, which is my parent element of my list. So with our header, we have this is our logo, and then this is all of the rest of the content. And this little trick that you can do, if you do margin left, and then if you set it to auto, and what this is going to do is it's going to try to fill in all of as much white space as possible. And it's going to say, hey, dynamically push it as far. And then when you resize it, you'll notice that it doesn't get cropped out until there's nowhere for it to go. So by this point, you would probably add something like a media query and say, hey, when your screen is, I would say probably like this size or less, make it like a drop-down menu or something like that. Yes.
I don't understand why you put auto inside the margin left, but then it just.
Yeah, so what auto is doing is it's saying, okay, let's look at our nav menu, which is all of these items. And then it's saying, okay, for the left margin, so the space that is to the left of it, let's fill up as much as we can with a margin. So auto is just saying like, hey, look at the screen size and it auto adjusts. Yeah. And so it's saying like, hey, right now we have this much room that we can push. So let's do that. And then if we go like this, it's saying like, oh, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And then by this point, it's like, hey, the content is like this big and like there's nowhere for it to go. So we just have to crop it. Yeah. Usually what that might do is it sometimes will do this weird thing where it will like give a bit of this weird situation where the header is actually only this big. And so what this does is it doesn't look at like how big the header size is at all. And when you change it to margin left auto, it's more looking at your screen size and not like this imaginary box around your content. It kind of depends on the situation. Like, let's say I had this down here. I'm going to do like a div, and this is going to be a practice area. I'll put an image, and I will put in, let's say this one. And then let's say I had some paragraph text, and I save, like, let's say I'm like all the way down here, and playing around with this. And let's say I wanted like this text to be to the right of it and it like wraps. I could do like, let me do this real quick. If I put this width to be about like, let's say 500 pixels, and then I put height to auto. So it's just kind of looking at like, hey, I set this width to be this much, the height determined so that the aspect ratio is the same. And then if I were to put float left here, what it's going to do is it's going to, if guess I did something wrong. Oh, I didn't save the HTML document. So now what it's going to do is it's going to float the image to the left, but it does this kind of weird thing where the footer is also there. But then if, let's say I were to add like a bunch of this text, it now like automatically wraps. So usually like just using float is mostly for like text wrapping. But headers and footers is normally you're playing around with like margins and stuff like that. All right. So now that I'm back here, the last thing that I maybe want to do is maybe for my contact buttons, I want there to be like even more space and I want there to be rounded corners. So if I go to my contact button, or maybe I want this for all of my buttons. So let's just go to our buttons and let's put our border radius to 50 pixels. And then you're going to see what it does is that it's going to round all of these corners. If you have set your border radius to, let's say, like 50%, that would change a square to a perfect circle. And so a lot of this I find is just playing around with numbers until something looks good. But if we wanted, for example, to put our headers in the center, you could go to where those are and do text align center. And so I did that for my H1. So now my H1's in the exact middle of our screen.